Okay, it's 12:02 by my watch, so why don't we go ahead and get started? Thank you for joining us, everyone. My name is Amanda Graham. I am the academic director for the Arthur L. Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth College. And together with our colleagues at all of these universities across the nation and even over in Europe, we have been really delighted to curate a series this past year and a half of young up and coming scholars in the energy and society space, and give a platform for them to share their research, meet each other, meet you all, and engage hopefully in improving their work as they break into the space of the really important space of research and inquiry in energy and society. So I'm really delighted today to introduce our speaker to you. We are joined today by Dr. Liz Allen from Northeastern University. She is a research development officer there and a former postdoc with the Global Resilience Institute at Northeastern. She's also been an associate research scientist there. And she is going to be speaking with us today on a project titled Envisioning the Future of Sharing in Electrical Energy Systems. And so she's going to be sharing with us what she means by sharing in this particular case. And Liz comes to this position with her PhD in Environmental and Natural Resource Sciences from Washington State University. Her master's is from Clark University and her bachelor's from the University of Oregon. So she has really spread around her education from several different institutions, and including actually the Peace Corps. She did a stint in Armenia in the Peace Corps as well as part of her trajectory. I do also want to point out to folks. Liz was lead author on an important paper on redistributing power, looking at gender issues in the energy transformation. So if you haven't seen that paper already, it's a good and an important one, and I'll drop the citation in the chat as we get going, because it's something that we all should be attending to, is not just how we are addressing the climate and the emissions and the zero carbon issues that we need to address in energy, but also the equity issues, including gender as well as racial and ethnic equity and diversity as well. So applause to you, Liz, for lead authoring that paper with Jenny Stevens and other colleagues. So with that, I'm going to step away and give the mic and the camera over to Liz to give her talk to us. If you have any questions while she's talking, please pop them in the Q&A. And then I'll come back on camera when Liz finishes up for hopefully a lively question, answer, and discussion session. So thank you very much. And Dr. Allen, please take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Amanda. And yeah, this is an amazing series, and I'm very honored to be part of it. I was sharing with Amanda and Stephanie right before we started today's session that I'm going to be speaking about research, which is a little over a year old, and that I really feel like I haven't had the opportunity yet because of kind of exciting things happening in my career transitions, and also because of the global pandemic, to share with a broader audience. So I believe that you can see the PowerPoint that I'm sharing now. And yeah, as Amanda kind of foreshadowed, I'm really interested in the social and policy dimensions of energy system transitions. And so I'm going to talk today about envisioning the future of sharing in electrical energy systems, and where there may be some emerging opportunities as well as risks related to the resilience, sustainability, and equity of our energy systems, and focusing on a US context, but drawing some examples from electrical energy systems globally. So energy systems around the world are undergoing a transformation towards more distributed, renewable-based configurations, where these new mechanisms for sharing are evolving. Future energy systems are likely to integrate a regionally appropriate mix of renewable energy generation that's dispatched, stored, and distributed through platforms that enable sharing at multiple scales. So this sharing in future electric systems has the potential to disrupt relationships governing utilities, energy consumers, and distributed electricity generation at the household level, but also at regional, national, and international levels. Innovations are allowing formerly passive consumers to become actively engaged in producing and managing electricity, which is shifting the locus of organizational decision-making and control away from traditional utilities. So we kind of see this in the same way that Uber and Airbnb have disrupted existing transportation and hospitality industries. The electricity sector may also be trending towards large-scale system reconstruction by way of innovations for energy sharing. We have also seen in recent years the rise of a new group of energy platform operators, such as thermostat companies, that are acting as energy service providers that position themselves as the electricity sharing economy platform facing a household consumer. So let's advance my slide. So yeah, today I'm sharing work that came out of an interdisciplinary research collaboration with other colleagues at Northeastern University to understand the social and sustainability potentials of and the possible unintended consequences of the emerging sharing economy in different sectors. And with this team of co-authors, Dr. Mike Kane, Dr. Jenny Stevens, and PhD student Yutong Si, we worked to define a framework for conceptualizing emergent types of electricity sharing and considering the interconnections of technological innovations and social innovations. So the energy historian, I should have checked how to pronounce the name. This book is fascinating, Energy and Civilization, the History. Vaclav Smil or Smil, sorry that I don't know the proper pronunciation, suggests that energy is the only universal currency, and that over the course of human history, the course over human history can be understood as an ongoing quest for more concentrated, versatile, efficient, and affordable forms of energy. And the regulatory frameworks that we have evolved in parallel with transformations of technology and business models. It's important to understand how these transformations evolved over the last century and the socio-technical factors that led to them, and to understand the disruptive potential of the sharing economy innovations within the electric energy sector. So traditional utilities are structured as regulated monopoly providers of electric power and grid services for a specific geographic area. The role of utilities is to deliver power to satisfy consumer demand, which may require the utility to generate, transmit, store, and/or purchase power, and also to regulate the frequency and voltage. Early on in sort of the history of the energy systems and utilities in the US, there were steep barriers to market energy because power plants and transmission lines were very expensive. So as a result, when household energy was introduced in the US in the early 1880s, it was really only available to wealthy homeowners in larger cities. And almost 90% of rural homes were without electricity in the early 20th century. But over time, growth in household energy demand drove down the average cost of delivered power, and that, combined with economies of scale and high barriers to entry, led to sort of the three dominant utility business models that operate in the US today, which are state-operated, not-for-profit, consumer-owned cooperatives, locally, publicly run or managed utilities, and investor-owned utilities. And although there's relatively few in number of investor-owned utilities, they tend to be very large and serve over 75% of energy consumers nationwide in the US. So this graphic on this slide is kind of a representation of the dominant aspects of the evolving social, political, and technological context that have shaped priorities and spurred innovations in the US electric power sector over the last century. Like I was saying, the emphasis 100 years ago was largely on increasing the population's access to safe and affordable electric power. In the 60s, the occurrence of like a major blackout in New York City in 1965 was a wake-up call to the power industry. And the response was to create voluntary utility managed reliability organization, the North America Electric Reliability Council, or NERC, to promote improved reliability of the electric grid. Then in the 1970s, which saw the oil embargo and rapid increases to the cost of fuel to operate power plants, there was, a consequent large jump in retail power prices, and a lot of then utilities were prompted to construct new power plants that relied on domestic coal and uranium, which cost a lot more to build than simple oil or natural gas fired generators. And the fixed cost of utility operations increased, leading to consumer prices to increase and complaints and increased regulatory oversight. This is also the era where there's kind of a growing recognition of the environmental and human health costs of power generation and calls for cleaner production. In the decades since then, priorities for energy system security and resilience have dominated the technological innovations. So looking at technologies to improve power systems' ability to withstand extreme events and to regain function quickly following a disruption have kind of dominated the agenda of energy managers. And so we now see in the present era the emergence of this new priority of flexibility, or the ability for consumers to select their electric energy source. And we understand that the evolution of energy sharing systems as part of this era of flexibility being prioritized, where new technology and consumer preferences are driving energy system innovations. So, over time, there's been a wide range of institutional models shaped by the technological and socio-political factors that have emerged to provision energy for households and for industry. Across the world, electric power markets operate in a pretty wide variety of forms. They're very heterogeneous, but lie on this spectrum from monopolization to democratization, and the evolution of energy systems and markets around the world, has been really variable. So on the left side of this figure, the vertically integrated utilities have centrally controlled supply, transmission, and distribution infrastructure. In some countries, deregulated markets were established through the restructuring of some of the existing utilities with the intent to disrupt energy generation monopolies by increasing competition. And so in deregulated electric grids, electric energy capacity and reserves are each traded on a wholesale market, which must meet consumer demands while satisfying any constraints of the transmission system, such as line limits. And then in the schematic on the far right of this diagram, this depicts an energy choice system where energy users have the opportunity to select from among multiple energy providers based on rates and energy generation options. So, for example, the opportunity to select renewable-based energy. So this is the sort of taxonomy of electric energy sharing that I developed with co-authors of this chapter that I'm talking about today, representing 4 distinct categories for sharing electric energy that have emerged based on market structures and services being provided. Electric energy markets are unique compared to other sharing economies in that the product being traded is not discrete in the sense that a ride between 2 points or a night or 2 in an Airbnb is a discrete commodity. Also, energy can't be easily stored, and transferring energy in space and time requires really specialized infrastructure, including the wires and transformers that have limited capacity. So this table represents a framework and a taxonomy for sharing economy approaches along 2 dimensions. On the vertical dimension, the market structure, and on the horizontal dimension, the services provided. The services encompassed by a sharing economy may only include energy, or they may include all of the services required to operate an electricity system, which including the energy, voltage, and frequency control and asset management. Along the vertical market structure dimension, the prices and availability of services can be determined by a top-down centralized system or a more bottom-up decentralized structure. So in the next few slides, I'll kind of discuss in detail what in practice energy sharing looks like in each of these 4 categories that we've defined. So in a traditional utility control, the utility controlled system approaches to energy sharing, the consumers don't generate electricity, but provide value through their flexibility to shift demand. And this is realized through demand response programs that request users turn off large loads, such as their air conditioners during times when the grid might overload. Similarly, time of use pricing enables users to shift their energy use to the times when low cost and sometimes renewable energy is available and can be transmitted to the consumer. So in utility controlled energy sharing, innovations are emerging that enable customers to share the value of their flexibility to change aggregate demand in real time. Both demand response and time of use pricing can work automatically or by active participation of consumers. For example, when you receive a text prompt to modify your behavior. Consumers can potentially benefit from sharing by avoiding situations where electrical power would otherwise be interrupted and reducing their electrical energy bill by adjusting their behavior based on signals from the utility service provider. These utility control sharing mechanisms can be a considerable benefit to the customers who have the flexibility and information access necessary to modify their energy usage in response to market signals. But since the average US household spends only around 2% of its income on electric energy, the various consumption-specific social and behavioral factors to make household level flexibility difficult and they make it difficult to have that much flexibility, and the elasticity of energy consumption is relatively low. Also, in low-income households may spend up to 30% of their income on electric energy, and demand response and time of use pricing may place an inequitable burden on already disadvantaged consumers if they lack the technology or the flexibility that would be needed to adjust their energy usage in response to market signals. So with consumer choice energy sharing, there's top-down centralized management of energy without the complexity of real-time control of the grid. There's various forms of consumer choice energy sharing that are possible, excuse me, on an hourly, daily, or on monthly timescales. These are distinct from utility controlled energy sharing examples that I just discussed, in that they engage the consumer in financing distributed energy resources, either at the site of consumption or remotely. Distributed energy resources are also called DERs, are decentralized because they rely on energy sources other than the utility to provide energy. DERs allow prosumers to buy energy from their preferred source, which is usually renewables, and to reduce their bills through efficiency upgrades or to sell excess renewable energy that they generate back to the grid at favorable prices. In net metering, consumers have the opportunity to produce energy locally and use their energy first, selling any excess back to the grid. Sometimes energy sales back to the grid are managed on a yearly basis, but more typically on a monthly basis. Electricity consumers who generate their own energy on site. So I think I basically covered it. You know, the figure here shows a generalized scheme for how energy choice and net metering systems interface with traditional utility-based models. So in the prosumer case, showing that two-way arrow between the utility and the prosumer. Excuse me. The photo on this slide is from Mosaic Energy. Mosaic and other similar companies enable energy consumers to become prosumers by financing their initial solar panel installation, and then the prosumer pays back the loan over time with interest as they're selling energy back to the utility. And so Mosaic and other similar businesses provide a platform that connects investors with borrowers seeking to finance solar power projects. Excuse me. The recent advances in regulatory structures and technology have enabled the emergence of peer-to-peer energy sharing, such as community solar programs in which solar panels or other DERs are installed on shared land, while the dividends for the energy produced are paid out to the community. And even more recently, energy blockchains have emerged, functioning as a decentralized ledger to track energy consumption, storage, and generation. Excuse me. To track energy storage and generation through a digital platform, and to enable energy consumers and producers to choose when, how, and with whom, and at what price electricity is purchased and sold. So examples of peer-to-peer sharing include community choice aggregation, as well as more sophisticated energy trading platform startups such as Van de Bron in the Netherlands, which is an electricity trading platform that allows people to buy energy from independent producers, for example, to contract specifically with a farmer who has wind or solar on their fields. So it sort of functions as an Airbnb for electricity, but this type of business model may be easier to implement in a country like the Netherlands, where there's a deregulated energy market in comparison to the more regulated energy sector system that we have in the US. So the challenge in the future of electric energy sharing is how to share all aspects of the operation, safety, management of the electric energy system. Community microgrids promise to realize this future through breakthroughs in automation, machine learning, and digital platforms, with both digital and physical aspects that enable sharing of distribution systems or a fully shared grid. Community microgrids rely heavily not just on shared generation. Excuse me, it's a danger of giving these talks that you run out of vocal power. Give me a moment here. In the meantime, formulating questions. I'm sure we'll have an interesting discussion after this. So in a shared grid arrangement, distributed energy resources may include energy storage and parked electric vehicles, smart thermostats that run only when energy is available, and smart solar inverters that can help stabilize voltage and frequency on the shared wires. So the sharing is the responsibility so consumers are sharing responsibility to balance supply and demand, and it reduces costly peaks in transmission and creates a more resilient electric energy supply that can continue operating even when the larger grid suffers a blackout. So does all of this represent perhaps a death spiral for the traditional utility business model? As the pace of transformation in electrical energy generation and distribution systems continues to accelerate, the possibilities for innovative ways to share electricity are rapidly growing. And so currently there's a transition in effect away from legacy systems with high levels of utility control and toward these new opportunities for prosumer engagement, peer-to-peer sharing, ultimately moving in this direction of a fully shared grid system. In this clockwise trend away from utility control to prosumer and to systems where there's a more decentralized market structure and integrated end-to-end management of energy and assets, we see this possible death spiral where the traditional utility business model may no longer be viable as third-party platforms for energy sharing and technologies enable more local renewable energy generation, storage, and supply and demand management. We anticipate that traditional integrated power supply and grid management role of utilities may become less viable in many regions. So in addition to the rise in prosumers who are both energy users and energy generators, future energy sharing could also lead to a growing number of passive electricity consumers who are integrated into community microgrids. We anticipate that prosumers, currently primarily homeowners who own private renewable energy generation infrastructure, will increasingly be outnumbered by energy consumers whose energy purchasing decisions are regulated by smart devices. So what are the implications of these emerging forms of energy sharing? The disruptions to the traditional energy system underway raise some really important questions about, excuse me, about resilience, sustainability and equity. In much the same way that sharing economy platforms such as Airbnb have simplified the process of contracting with an independent short-term lodging provider, electricity sharing has the potential to radically change how energy consumers interact and behave. So we can already see indications of the impacts of projected future change for the grid in the examples that we see of the emergence of smart devices such as thermostats operated by third-party platforms that optimize their demand based on real-time energy markets. In some sectors, for example, like app-based ride sharing, disrupting transportation, or excuse me, or the emergence of clothing rental businesses that disrupt traditional fashion retail, there's speculation that a rise in the sharing economy may also represent a path towards more unsustainable consumption and a culture of consumerism. In the case of energy sharing, we anticipate a somewhat different trajectory because increased sharing may not necessarily increase consumption of fossil fuels. The transformations that we've discussed are in many ways connected to a larger trend towards increased renewable energy generation. Also, electric energy consumption is relatively inelastic compared to those other consumer goods examples of clothing and sort of those type of things. So where reducing the price of clothing or the accessibility of a sharing model business may increase consumption, the similar trend wouldn't really be expected in the case of energy sharing. Yeah, for the average consumer is most likely not aware of the cost of running their dishwasher and makes it harder to modify behavior based on that. We have a traditional monthly electric billing cycle where the cost of consumption is not very transparent to the consumer. New real-time like Internet of Things devices could better synchronize consumption costs, but there has to be consideration of not having too much information overload for end users in real time, which would likely make them just disengage and not make their consumption decisions based on that information. So there's tremendous potential societal benefits of increased sharing. Possible benefits of a transition towards peer-to-peer and shared electric energy systems include improved efficiency and increased share of renewable energy generation production, which may include sites of energy generation closer to end users and improve system resilience to extreme weather events, more consumer engagement. In addition, these new mechanisms for local control and local management provide individuals, households, and communities with more economic and political power, as well as their electrical power. We note that at the same time that sharing economy innovations enable consumers to have more say in where and how their electricity is produced, there are some possible negative consequences associated with the transition to a shared grid system and associated energy democratization processes. The increased development of community microgrid systems could potentially lead to inequality in access and greater disparities in access to reliable electric energy, because the traditional electric energy grid is not just providing energy, it's providing the service of energy reliability, which is critical to not just economic productivity, but safety and social well-being. And if the transformation underway in the electric energy sector does in fact represent a death spiral of the traditional utility business model, the result could be that only wealthy energy consumers could afford access to a reliable community microgrid, and fewer resources would go towards maintaining the traditional distribution grid. So it could also, this could represent a decrease in energy reliability for customers who don't have access to or can't afford to participate in the microgrid system. One possible solution for this potential challenge would be to increase public investment in shared grids for communities who may not otherwise have access to emerging energy sharing systems. And so in the chapter that we wrote, we suggested that this practice could in some ways resemble the move in recent decades towards public-private partnerships that support charter schools in low-income communities. So kind of this turning towards public-private partnerships as a possible partial solution to the inequality of turning away from a more centralized management system. Another way that energy sharing is tied to disruption and transformation in the electric energy sector is through altering the geographic distribution of energy generation. So historically, power generation was occurring near coal reserves or hydroelectric facilities. With increased local solar and wind power energy generation, the preferred sites are changing, and the power lines built for transmission over long distances may not be optimally placed. So this leads to increased risk of congestion. But building new lines is exceedingly expensive, and there's a market opportunity to invest in reducing energy consumption demand. For example, it's a lot cheaper to give away smart thermostats and selectively adjust to them automatically during peak demand times than it is to build an entirely new transmission line. So that example points to just one of the ways where new technologies are changing the social and economic priorities that may transform the electrical energy sector. So looking ahead, there's a need for more research on policy mechanisms to promote and regulate sharing in real-world energy systems. Barriers to redesigning the current energy system include the current regulatory systems that we have in place, as well as a lack of public awareness and acceptance of new technologies, and to establish corporations' resistance to change. And this resistance can lead to manipulation of markets and disinformation campaigns that question the legitimacy and reliability of alternative energy systems. Government and regulatory bodies have an important role to play in facilitating a transition to increased electrical energy sharing. And policymakers could, for example, establish incentives in the form of subsidies for new energy sharing enterprises entering the market, and create regulatory frameworks such as a tax on carbon or pollution charges for fossil fuel-based energy systems. By enacting policy measures such as these and providing a fair competition environment, government regulatory bodies can facilitate increasing energy sharing systems that balance the goals of efficiency, sustainability, resilience, and equity. So that concludes the presentation. I'm really looking forward to questions and discussion, and also happy to talk a little bit more about kind of how I see this intersecting with some of my other research interests around diversifying leadership for energy system decision-making. And and I actually have one more slide just to connect this to work currently happening at Northeastern University, led by some of the collaborators who were part of this research that I discussed today. So we have a whole energy home study led by Professor Mike Kane and colleagues in the School of Architecture and College of Computer Science. And we're looking at how people interact with their thermostats to control their home heating and cooling systems, with the goal of essentially designing more flexible, adaptive algorithms for managing how electric energy is consumed at the household level, and reducing demand during sort of peak demand events. So this is exciting research that involves a real public engagement component, which is why I've stayed connected to it and affiliated with this project. It's ongoing now. So looking forward to questions and discussions, and I'll stop sharing slides now.
Excellent.
So we can come back together.
Thank you so much, Liz. I really appreciate this this dive into looking at these different models and sort of the progression that you envision, right, from where we are today to some different possibilities for how we manage our electricity delivery. We've got a number of questions coming in the chat, which is great. I mean, sorry, and in the Q&A, not in the chat, in the Q&A. The first question is from Elizabeth Wilson, our director of the Irving Institute here at Dartmouth, and she asks, can you help us understand which policies can ensure that all consumers have access to these innovations in community and shared energy? In the past, credit score minimums did not allow consumers with bad past credit to take advantage of these innovations. Are there any new policies which should be implemented to ensure equity? So digging in a little bit to those equity considerations that you highlighted.
Yeah, this is an excellent question. And, you know, I don't know sort of what's at the forefront of policy innovations proposed in communities where kind of a community microgrid initiatives are being pursued in terms of what the priorities are to move towards a system that ensures equity and the opportunity to participate and to prioritize serving communities that have been, you know, sort of historically marginalized and last on the list of major utility service providers, you know, thinking about ensuring reliability and security. So I think it's a great question. Unfortunately, I'm sort of not well equipped to say what could be prioritized. And yeah, welcome chiming in. I know that this forum doesn't necessarily allow people to pop up and share a perspective, but I know that there's probably people who are working directly on these issues.
Well, I'll join your welcome for folks to contribute in the Q&A if you want to comment on further on this particular point, especially this question about the credit score minimums and how to address, you know, that as a challenge. Second question here is, left unregulated, do you believe that this new shared energy system structure will overall result in more or less equity in energy services? I think this is a good question because I was hearing both the pros, right, of local control, but also the cons of potentially reduced reliability for some users, right? So further, what type, if any, new regulations do you think will need to be considered for this new decentralized energy structure?
Yeah, this is absolutely a set of like technologies and opportunities that pull in both directions. And I do think that any time when there is a sort of large technological transformation underway, it's an opportunity for social innovation and for us to really push forward the goals of increased equity and participatory decision making. Again, I apologize for being kind of short on the specifics to say you know, exactly where I think sort of regulatory responses need to evolve. But yeah, again, I think that hopefully this opens up a lot of ideas for future research and
okay.
Yeah.
So I guess one of the things that occurs to me as we're absorbing your work and thinking about the implications of it, I mean, it might be helpful for you to give just a little bit of a précis or a background on how you understand energy democracy, and I think that you included that as part of the framing, right, for the conversation that we had. But if part of the progression that you're looking at here in the utility space, right, is from something that's very vertically integrated towards something that works more towards greater more localized control, tell us how that is related to an overarching approach or understanding of our systems of governance, more broadly writ, and how that enacts energy democracy in your view.
Yeah, I think Amanda, in sort of your description, you said a lot of the key pieces of what the the principles of energy democracy involve, and it's really this idea that you know, coupled with a shift towards um, the sort of increased recognition of the potential of renewable energy resources, the priority of decentralizing our energy systems, and strengthening local control and decision making for yeah, the means of generation, but also the access to take advantage of those resources and to benefit economically. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think there's some really fantastic thinking that has guided my understanding of energy democracy from leaders in sort of community development and um, yeah, we definitely, like in the chat, I can try to share some references, also like going back to the work that I had the opportunity to do with Jenny Stevens, looking at the role of diversifying leadership and specifically women's leadership in energy system decision making. You know, I think that there's a really rich conversation underway about what this could look like in practice of having increased control over the means of energy generation and accessing energy.
This would be a great spot if you wanted to give us a little bit more of that insight from the diversifying power study that you participated in. Um, what role do you see for women in leadership of the energy transitions and transformations?
Yeah, so we did kind of an in-depth look at two organizations that are working in very different ways to address inequalities and unsustainable aspects of the sort of dominant energy system in the US. And we looked at the sort of framing of initiatives led by the organization's Mothers Out Front, which started in Massachusetts and has grown to be a national organization with national chapters working on a range of issues with the goal of decarbonizing our energy system and ensuring a sort of proactive response to the emerging climate change risks. And it really is an initiative that very in their messaging, in their framing of the challenge and the need for policy action, uses this idea of motherhood as an organizing force, and to think about sort of tradition and almost draws on these traditional ideas, gendered ideas of mothers as protectors and defenders of future generations, and kind of cultural ideas about motherhood to assert a need for leadership action. And it's very interesting, I think, just to see how that plays out in the case of Grid Alternatives. You know, that's an organization based in California. And leader Erica Mackey has been a very vocal advocate for sort of training and engaging diverse populations, including women, but including other groups that are marginalized, to come together around sort of benefiting from the economic opportunities tied to the renewable energy transition and being leaders in that space. So I think that it's just, you know, it was really fascinating digging into the case studies of those organizations and also to the writing about the environmental movement as it connects to feminist movement in the US, and some of the complexities, I think, of any assumption that the renewable energy transition is, it is a woman's issue, but it's, there's always this tension of falling back on really sort of gendered ideas about whose voice matters, or in what way, for what reasons. But I think the big underlying undercurrent of all of this is that we need more voices represented and more diverse voices represented in any decision making.
Great, thank you. So I've got a question here that I think is a big one, but a good one. Can you please help us to understand why local control of energy systems is so good? If it is more expensive, couldn't it also increase local inequality for consumers who cannot afford the increase in costs? If you cared about decarbonization and equity, might larger projects be able to deliver the benefits at lower costs? So do you have, how might you respond to that with either at the hypothetical or with maybe specific examples, right, that could illustrate the benefits?
Yeah, I think that this is a great question. And I mean, like I talked about just now, there are some real concerns with a shift towards locally based systems of community microgrids, and the potential for a lot of disparities in how those infrastructures are created and managed across sort of the socioeconomic disparities that we see across the nation. I think the real key is thinking about how we allocate collective resources so that all communities have the means to design, like, participate in the design of a system that meets their needs. And so I think that there is room for a real conversation about how we distribute collective resources, but still keep the locus of decision making at the community scale, where the participants have a voice in the just navigating these trade-offs, because there are trade-offs. And so just that engagement and consultation, I think, becomes really centrally important.
Thank you for that. Another question posed by our strategic advisor, Stephen Doig, here at the Irving Institute, who observes that member-owned electric distribution systems, or co-ops, electric co-ops, have benefited many local communities for decades. Is there an opportunity to refresh this concept with some of the points you've made to create a more equitable energy system in the future? In other words, can we leverage our tradition, of local member-owned co-ops in the context of the progression that you're seeing?
I think absolutely yes. And again, this is, a lot of it's new territory for me, so I don't know the intricacies of like what the barriers to that may be. And but I think absolutely that the cooperative model is something to learn from, and think about how we integrate that model with the emerging technologies that enable this shift towards all of the sharing potential in the electric grid.
So another audience member asks about sort of recent developments, and here it really may be. I know that your work on this project was a year or so ago, but in light of some recent developments, i.e., the newly passed infrastructure bill, right, which is going to throw a whole lot of funds into the energy system. do you have a sense for how that could or should, right, in your view, affect the trends that you're seeing? Do you think that you would, where could those dollars be of best use, right, for fostering the kind of models that you're suggesting here?
Yeah, I think just really in thinking about these renewable energy generation at the community scale, structured in a way that it, involves local labor and, meets the needs of sort of community organizations to spin up that generation infrastructure and support a transition away from fossil fuels. Also, just investment in efficiency, I think, is a huge priority. And there are, like we talked about, many of initiatives where it's actually economically most cost effective to give consumers access to resources that enable them to use energy more efficiently than to invest in increased generation. So I think that, again, the answer is really regionally variable and has to be kind of locally defined about the sort of most appropriate priority in any given urban area or community. But I guess I would say, and investing in renewable generation that's accessible to the broadest sector of the population possible, and investing in efficiency programs, to obvious places.
Okay, thank you. Dominic Carisi, a grad student here, asks, to what degree are people or consumers the entities who actually do the sharing? Or is energy being shared for people, not by them? For example, perhaps high technologies and coextensive institutions, I'm not exactly sure what that means, are the entities enacting most electrical sharing, while people themselves can neither own nor share electrical energy. So in other words, perhaps comparing to the energy that's shared in a small scale agricultural sharing economy, who's actually doing the sharing in the models that you're articulating here?
Yeah, this is really interesting. I mean, and I think it's part of the genesis of this project came out of an initiative where we were working closely with other sub teams of researchers who were, who are looking at sharing in the transportation sector and the emergence of ride sharing or sharing in food systems or other sort of supply chain issues, where it is this sort of, I think, sometimes nebulous idea of who is actually doing the sharing and the brokering of that sharing, which has to be part of any sort of type of sharing energy. So there's certainly, I think it's a space where in any form of looking at emerging sharing economy models, we have to be carefully asking about who's profiting from it and who has access to the information that is required to manage these systems. I'm rereading this question to see if I missed coextensive institutions. But I think it's a good point that this type of sharing can't exist without the emergence of some kind of broker or
Right.
System operator.
Right, to ensure that since it's not a direct to direct, right? Who's going to be playing that role, that mediating role in the middle? So one very quick question here: if you could send to us the title of the book that you referenced at the start of your talk. Let's drop that. We can drop that in the chat here. Okay, so
yeah, I'll drop it in the chat.
Yep.
This is Energy and Civilization: A History.
Great.
It's a fascinating book, and I think fascinating also because as you start to look at the history of energy technologies and energy systems, I think we start to realize that this is all relatively recent in human history, and humans are innovative, and we can, I think, really be subjected to a lot of messaging from fossil fuel industry that, you know, it's impossible to radically change where we are now, but it's, I think, very instructive to see the ways that society has rapidly restructured in many ways to get to the point where we are now. And so
I think
it's fascinating kind of to delve into that history of energy systems, which I'm not an expert, but excited to learn more myself. So
well, I think it's a great point to end on, actually, that that energy transitions have happened before and will happen again, right? We're undergoing certainly a major moment of transformation now, and we don't know exactly how it will play out, but you're right that we have seen past energy transitions and have come out better on the other side. So Liz, I want to thank you very much for sharing your work with us today, and for sharing this discussion with us today. It's been a really interesting delving into a new set of models, or a sort of a shared set of models for how to think about what's ahead for us in our electricity systems. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for hosting this conversation, and really excellent questions. So I'm looking forward to learning from all of the attendees and people who shared their ideas here.
Thank you so much. And I think that Stephanie's ready to put up a slide of our upcoming events at the Irving Institute. And so we're getting towards the end of fall term here at Dartmouth. So our last Dartmouth Energy Collaborative Seminar of the fall is next Tuesday at 12:15, where we'll be introducing our new home. We have a new high performance building on the Dartmouth campus that the Irving Institute will be moving into over the coming weeks. And so join us next week to get a little bit of an insider's view on where we're going to be living. And then see you next year in 2022 for the kickoff of our new energy series talks for winter and then spring. We start again on January 19th. So be watching this space for our featured speakers next time. Thank you again for joining us, everyone. Be well, and I hope it's not too early to say happy holiday season to everyone. So thank you again, Liz, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.